So, as the audience is still dialing in, I'd like to welcome you all to our panel with the title Top-Down or Bottom-Up, Socio-political Analysis of Power Structures and Local Initiatives. I think this is a wonderful topic because sometimes it seems as climate change was a technical problem or just a question of the political will of ruling elites, but it's so much more. It is about societies adapting to climate change, but also dealing with reforms in the context of climate change in very different political contexts, regime types, possibilities of participation, different types of mobilizations, movements, NGOs, associations, party systems. So the possibilities are huge, but so are the complexities. So I'm very happy to introduce you to our three distinguished speakers today, who will tackle certain issues within specific context and give us answers of how to conceptualize and also implement effectively policy changes fighting against climate change, but also how to deal with climate change as such when we talk about this complex structure. My name is Irene Weipert-Fenner and I work at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. I work on social movements and political transformations in the Middle East and North Africa with a focus on Egypt and Tunisia, and I'm also an AGIA member. Our three presentations will be held first by Camille Belmin, who is a PhD researcher in the Future Lab Social Metabolism and Impacts at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Humboldt University of Berlin. Her research focuses on the effects of access to modern energy on the fertility transition in low-income countries and relevant applications for sustainable development policies. Her work lies at the intersection of sociology of energy, demography, and social metabolism. Here you'll have a presentation on the intersection between energy, gender equality, and sustainability research. Our second presentation will be by Georg Heinemann, who is a PhD candidate at the Berlin University of Technology, the work group of economics and infrastructure policy. His research interests include energy access, environment and sustainability transformation studies, as well as institutional economics. Furthermore, he co-leads a junior research group, Microenergy Systems. Welcome, Georg. And finally, we have Ahmed Tarek al-Ahwal from Cairo. If I got it right before, at least from Egypt, this is what I was told from the program. He is an urban management specialist working in the fields of urban mobility and urban water management. He's the co-founder and project coordinator of Tabdeel, the Center for Bicycle and Pedestrian Urbanism in Egypt, as well as Tricul for water management and technologies. He's currently engaged in research projects on the issues of urban mobility, water management, and land governance. He will talk about the aspects of injustice of cycling infrastructure provision in Egypt. So this is all very rich and we're very much looking forward to your presentations. As agreed before, we'll have 10 minutes per presenter and hopefully then roughly 30 minutes for the Q&A. As before, for our audience, when you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A function here in the Zoom. Just kindly mention your name and your country of residence at the moment where you're based and put your questions, and then the audience can rate the questions by giving thumbs ups and likes. So we will see the questions that were of most interest to all of you, and I will post them then, and if we have enough time, I would also kindly ask the person who asked the question to unmute herself and ask the question herself. So let's jump into medias res, and I give the floor to Camille.
You're still muted.
Sorry, here we go. So let me share my screen now. This one. Okay. Good. Yeah. So yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the organizers for hosting my presentation today in this session, and thanks Irene for the presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you about the relationship between access to modern energy and the demographic transition. And it's, of course, related to how more energy justice could lead to more reproductive rights, and while having co-benefits for sustainability. So for those of you who are not familiar with the idea of reproductive rights, they are the rights of individual to decide whether to reproduce or to have reproductive health. It's a human right since 1968, but today there's about 45% of women who lack of decision-making power regarding their reproductive rights and their reproductive health. So what enables women to have more control over those reproductive choices? So we've made a short, a small conceptualization of what enables those reproductive choices, and there are several components. One is empowerment. So in order to make choice, you need to have the power to do so. And in that case, education of girls and women and labor market participation for more financial autonomy can enable or facilitate such empowerment. A second aspect is having access to relevant information through the use of modern media, to have information on reproductive health, and also be familiarized with low fertility norms or alternative fertility norms, I would say. And a third component is what I call freedom from material constraint. And this refers to, first of all, the reduced need for child labor. So in some communities, children are valuable in household production. So they really help in the household chores. So if you don't have that many needs for children labor, you're more free to make reproductive choices. A second aspect is child mortality and women's health. So it has been shown that the more child mortality, the higher will be the fertility in the household, because parents would have more children in order to reach the desired fertility. And then it brings me to what's the relation of access to modern energy to all of those components. First, access to electricity in particular can increase the use of modern media and the access on reproductive health. Second, access to clean cooking fuel drastically reduces indoor pollution and therefore reduces child mortality and improves women's health. And a third component is that access to modern form of energy reduces time spent on housework, which is generally done by women and children. So it reduces the need for child labor, and it saves us time for women to spend on alternative activities such as education or labor or employment. So here I talked about reproductive choice, but now I'm going to talk about fertility. So what's the relationship between those two? In fact, on average, improved reproductive choices are reflected by lower fertility, where women or people are able to make the decision for themselves. They tend to choose smaller families. Where choices are constrained, they tend to have families that are either very large or very small, or sometimes with no children at all. This is a citation from Natalia Kanem, the executive director of the UNPF. So my research question in my PhD and in this specific study is, does access to modern energy, namely access to electricity and access to modern cooking fuel, affect the average children born to a woman? And what moderates the strength of this relationship as a secondary research question? Very briefly, the goal, the data and methods. So the goal of the analysis was to bring evidence of this relationship for as many countries and contexts as possible, while focusing on low-income countries. So we created a panel data that is combined from 254 demographic and health survey data. And this results in a panel data containing 43 countries, 304 districts, and 17 years from 1990 to 2015. And with this panel, we made a fixed effect regression model where basically fertility in region I in time t is a function of access to modern energy. So it will be either access to electricity or access to modern cooking fuels, or access to both, plus a set of control variables that include level of education, urbanization, age at marriage, an indicator of conflict, and GDP per capita. Second analysis we've done was to do an interaction analysis. So here we looked at what factors moderate the strength of the relationship between modern energy access and fertility. So first of all, we found that controlling for other factors, access to modern energy has a negative effect on fertility with p-value inferior to 5%. And the second result we found is from the interaction analysis, and we found that the effect is higher in high fertility regions. And on this map, this pictures these results, because we have a map of the countries of almost all the countries of our analysis, and the color shows the marginal effect of access to modern energy on fertility. And you see that in countries that have relatively higher fertility, relatively lower fertility, so that are relatively advanced in the fertility transition, like for example, Colombia here, they have their marginal effect of modern energy on fertility is rather low, so it means that this effect will be small. Whereas in countries where the fertility transition is still at the beginning, the fertility is high, the effect will be stronger. And here in this inset, you can see that the resolution of the model is actually at the subnational level. And in areas like here, the most important economically city in Nigeria, it's an urban area, will have a lower marginal effect since the fertility there is relatively lower. The third results I'm going to present today was based on a small simulation we've done based on our results. So we've projected from 2015 to 2014 the fertility in 24 countries. And we based we had 3 scenarios. One was a baseline scenario where the education trend in the past continues, as well as the electricity access trend. In the purple scenario, you continue past education trends, but all countries reach 100% of access to electricity in 2014. And in the last scenario in orange, you have improved level of education and universal access to 2014. And we see that combining both improved education and improved access to electricity can reduce total fertility by 23%. Just a small note, you may wonder why I focused on education, but education is a factor of the demographic transition that has been widely acknowledged, and it's very studied. So it's sort of already acknowledged that it has a strong impact, whereas the effect of energy is not really well studied. So this brings me to the implication for sustainable development. So if energy access leads to fertility decline, this might be a sign that energy access enables better reproductive choices for women. And this means that energy access would mean that we could simultaneously achieve a reduction in energy injustice, better reproductive rights, and good health and well-being for people. And these are all three contained in the Sustainable Development Goals. Another important thing is that if energy access leads to a smaller population, then this could lead to a lower future energy demand as compared as scenarios where we don't take this relationship into account. So here what I mean is that there is a strand of literature that looks at how much energy is needed to end energy poverty, and how much, in a way, CO2 emission is needed to end energy poverty. So the results of this model is generally that alleviating extreme poverty doesn't cost much, nor much energy, nor much CO2 emissions, because most of the impacts are located in rich countries. But they generally find that reaching higher standards of living will then have a higher impact. But the thing is that in those studies, they typically take an energy access scenario and the population growth scenario, and then they estimate the future energy demands. But here we show that there is potentially an important relationship between energy access and population growth. And in that case, this would mean that less energy poverty would mean a smaller population and would lead to a lower future energy demand as compared as the current studies. So yeah, in a way, to wrap up, access to modern energy could not only improve reproductive rights for women, improve the well-being and the health, but could also have climate co-benefits that are not really taken into account at the moment. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. Thanks a lot. I suggest to move on right away to Georg. We'll do the Q&A all together after listening to all the presentations. Okay, Georg, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I share my screen. 1 second. So, can you see my presentation? Yeah? All right. Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you for also letting me be part of this session. I look at actually electricity provision in Tanzania and how energy access or electricity access is actually changing due to the question how public or private electrification is changing the framing and the perception of electricity as such. And it's actually part of my PhD studies. So I look in general at rural electrification and how to organize it with the provision of standalone solar home systems. So I look at different models, and this research is, this paper is part of it. I co-write it with my colleague from UC Berkeley, with Isa Farrell. And in general, as I said, I look at how the new forms of electricity provision such as solar home systems, in this case, are changing the perception of electricity. How is it related in the existing literature, and also how, for example, the different players, the financing and so on, is affected by these new forms of electricity provision. And especially if you look at current and past research, most of the research looking at energy access and is actually focusing on economic and technical perspectives, and the political perspective has been neglected. And already 10 years ago, for example, it was said that, I mean, actually politics is the most defining or most critical role in this process to achieve SDG 7, and even if you look further, that especially the energy poor, so people who don't have access yet, are mostly affected by either the private or public efforts. And so we look at the political economy of infrastructure provision. We have done literature review to see what has been considered in the past, and we consider institutional economic theory to really get a full perspective of the sector and the different norms, informal and formal, and also different stakeholders involved. And especially we look at the energy sector transformation and the local development perspective. And our main results are actually that energy transition is as such an uneven social and spatial process. We can actually definitely see that institutional arrangements, let it be the financing perspective or the different, let it be the public or private provision perspective, are definitely influencing the ramification of electricity, how electricity is perceived and how is it regarded as a common good or as a private consumer good in the society. And yes, and so definitely the question of energy access is redefining our perspective on what it should be, a public or a private perspective. If you look at the literature, electricity has always been very much connected to politics, and it's always the context of political and social structures which have driven electricity and has supported or inhibited the evolution of electricity or the electrical sector. And so electricity is quite an ideal lens to explore the dimensions of political economy, having this in mind. And if you look at the literature, we have defined three major clusters. First of all, there has been a lot of literature on how the electricity sectors in the developed countries have evolved over the years, how the change of traditional top-down fossil fuel-based electricity provision has changed, for example, to renewable energy technologies and the provision of clean energy. There's a lot of global comparison on energy market liberalizations using panel data and seeing how regulation and sector reforms have changed the different national ways or national electricity sectors. And number three is, of course, also how in developing countries sector reforms have changed and how it can be compared. However, it's mostly on-grid and off-grid electricity provisions, such as standalone solar home systems for electricity access, has been mostly not yet considered. And if we take a further look on our method, what is important for us to consider and what we have seen is still lacking is that you look at a complete context analysis to see, okay, what is the organizational model behind it? We don't want to only look at the technical system and let's say the basic demand and supply question, what you can see here at the bottom, but you have to consider the different interrelations within the sector and the model. So there are different tasks, of course, when you think about provision of electricity, you have roles to fulfill, and these roles are interdependent. And of course, then you have, if you take it another level, you have actors who can assume these roles, and these actors are also interrelated. And of course, there are institutions and also formal and informal norms who provide a complete context. And so you have to consider the whole organizational model, and you have to build an organizational model in order to try to see where the political economy of electricity provision is, or how the political economy is defined. And to consider like two very simple scenarios or like basic scenarios with basic parameters, we actually say, okay, on the one hand, you have the public provision, and on the other hand, you have the private provision. For public, we have actually, or in general, we have considered 4 parameters most relevant: timing, quality, cost, and equity. For the public scenario, you have generally a timing which is regarded as slow. So it takes, the public hand, it takes some time, especially sometimes ages, to provide electricity access, especially in rural areas. The quality is universal, meaning it can be bad or not bad. It's not really dependent, because it's always the grid. However, this is also a little bit simple, because of course you can have load shedding in some regions, so you have not stable electricity supply. But in general, it's a more universal approach. And the cost perspective is universal, so saying that it is regulated top down, and you can have, of course, subsidized tariffs, but it is actually dependent on the state and on the public. And the equity is actually, and that's of course a very political decision, it can't be there's no question, it's always a level playing field. Everyone has the right to energy, and the public cannot say that some areas are not getting electricity. However, of course, some areas might get later access to electricity than others, and that is the way how they manage the situation, although officially everyone is supposed to get access. And the private scenario is, of course, quite opposite. You have most of the times a fast approach, because private players try to get, of course, a return on investment as fast as possible. The quality can be also very dependent on the player and on the private actor and the regulation, which might be in place or not. If it's a fully private approach, there might be no regulation, the same as with the cost. And the equity is also mostly not regarded. And if you actually look at our preliminary findings here, is that we have looked in Tanzania at all the solar home system projects in the last, let's say, 10 years. We have actually done a desk review of more than 1,000 papers, having shortlisted 39 papers and then peer reviewed and said, okay, 20 publications are relevant for our question. And we found for the location that it's actually mostly located in regions which are populated and economic more active. So in the northern and eastern parts of the regions around Arusha, Lake Victoria, and Dar es Salaam. Themes, all kind of themes are covered by electricity access projects with solar home systems. Most of them have been like, what are drivers and barriers of solar home systems electrification, but also livelihood, of course, questions, how to finance them, agricultural use, and also sustainable market building. And operating schemes, 90% are, more than 90% actually are mixed. So you hardly see any pure public or private approach in Tanzania. And however, most of them are pilot projects. So you see that in Tanzania, it is still all in a pilot stage, that different schemes have been tested, and that there's no like huge public project to say, okay, large scale deployment and so on in place. And even from the private perspective, you hardly see, you have some cases, some private companies who are operating purely private, but that's a minority. For the timing, actually, of course, if you look at pilot projects, the timing is always already short limited, so timing hasn't been too relevant in this case. Quality and cost are super relevant. They are like very, very much regarded as drivers, and it has been always as key driver and key success factor for any political and socio-economic context, to say that the quality of the systems, the quality of the management of the program and of the context has been relevant. So quality is very important, and then the cost is also relevant in that regard, that in the moment that you introduce a new technology, you have to provide an affordable and accessible solution, so that it can be replaced with the current setting. And equity actually, and that's also quite interesting, is not relevant at all. I mean, that's a bit too strong, I would say, but it's not on the in the focus at the beginning, and that is actually quite an interesting remark, because if you consider that everyone should get access to electricity in the rural areas, and then all these projects are always looking only at some communities or some members of the communities or at some, let's say, productive use cases, it is hard to consider it as a, or there's actually lack of evidence to see, okay, what happens when the whole community, when the whole area or region is getting access. So it is, as far as we have seen here for our selection so far, it's that if you look at solar home systems projects, quality and cost are the ones, the parameters which are have to be addressed, are not so far addressed. So electricity is not either a state or market situation, and you have to see it more as a continuum of public and private mixes. So it's something which is evolving over time, and there can be different settings. So far we have tried to detail the strengths and weaknesses of the projects, and of, like, saying either it's private or public. We will, it's ongoing still, the research, so we are still like trying to filter out the findings and coming up actually with an organizational model which is more concise and more transparent to determine, like, our principal question, how solar home systems are in the end affecting electricity provision, and also the framings of electricity provision, if it should be a public or a private service for communities in rural areas. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Also very insightful. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
So let's switch to Ahmed. Please tell us something about the pedestrian culture and cycling in Egypt initiatives.
Thank you, Irene. Thanks all. Going to share the presentation now. So you can see the screen now, right?
Yeah.
Our presenting work of our organization Tabdeel about the aspects of justice and injustice in the infrastructure provision for bicycles in Egypt. Tabdeel, we're a participatory center that engages with research and advocacy related to cycling in Egypt. And we aim to produce knowledge collaboratively, and we do so through articles, workshops, book translations, and also tactical interventions. And for this research project, we have a grant from the Arab Council for Social Sciences, where we are studying projects of cycling infrastructure in Egypt in the last 10 years, and analyze them from the lenses of distribution, recognition, justice, and participation, and capability. And our hypothesis is that the projects don't meet the commuting needs of bicycle users, and therefore bicycle usage as a commute, as a transport, is not affected by these projects due to limitations of justice aspects. So quickly, in Egypt, in many of our workshops, people talk about how there used to be more bicycle usage than now. It used to be common before the 70s, really attributed to the increase of cars at the time, and car-centric planning, and how it made the streets unsafe for use. And since the numbers were in declining of users, however, in the past 10 years, along with the global movement to support support cycling, there has been an opportunity and renewed interest in cycling. Next to individual users, there are groups of bicycle users that start to cycle for sports and leisure, and then some of them use cycling also as a commute. And there were calls by the Egyptian president to encourage people to cycle and so on. While at the same time, the car-centric planning, car-centric infrastructure has continued, and we're seeing numbers of flyovers and highways built. And so we started mapping the projects for cycling infrastructure. We found 17 projects in Egypt in this past period. 7 were by the government, funded and initiated by the government. 5 were by the private sector, and 5 by civil society. The large majority of these projects were in Cairo region, and all privately provided projects were inside gated communities, but also almost all government projects are in newly constructed advantages, not only because of it being affluent neighborhoods with higher property prices, but also as they have more access to funding, as they have different governance structure than older parts or traditional parts of the cities in Egypt. And meanwhile, we're comparing during these projects how much sacrifice other street users are giving for the bicycle lanes, for example, and if there are other projects for other modes in the same area, we're comparing. And for example, we can see how recent bridges cost 8 bridges cost almost $1 million, while cycling lanes are being said that they are part of the normal street maintenance routine. These aspects we're comparing distribution of infrastructure with, and then we're starting to explore more the of users of bicycles in Egypt, to understand more who these projects are built for and their characteristics. And we could say that in general there are 2 big groups. The new cyclists, many of them say cycling is for them a choice for leisure and sport, and some don't commute, and they are not seen as the same as the other poorer bicycle users because of how they dress or the bicycle model and so on. So these new groups have managed to escape the stigma of cycling being for the poor, but at the same time create a separation and otherness between other groups. And they have also managed to increase support for women, as being in groups gives strength against street harassment while being exposed on a bicycle in the street. The other group, the more old school users, are in decline, and as we noticed, they're not visible in projects and media campaigns and so on, but they're also less organized and much more male-centered. And of course, there are users in between the different groups. We could see how the higher status group is, because it's organized and has more, is more able to push for infrastructure, and also is more invited and recognized in projects. We can see how many projects are directed towards leisure or sports cycling. On the left is a project on a highway that leads outside of Cairo, so it's not directed at commuting. And on the right is a project that is stated to have a goal of encouraging sports, and commuting is not a main aspect of it. And as we can see in other in all the city parts, we can see considerable amounts of bicycle users and parking in decline without much infrastructure. On the other hand, we see many ads of commuting, promoting the good and green life in suburbs, where it is very hard to cycle because of low density and high speeds, and so projects that get planned for the accessibility goals in new suburbs also struggle to meet their goals of accessibility, as people are not able to use these for commuting. This is a hypothesis that we are now testing with our research, with this ongoing research. And while most projects have little invited participation planned, the ones that have also haven't managed to capture all challenges in this project by the UNDP in a mid-sized city that has considerable bicycle usage. There are challenges to using the infrastructure for current users, as the network is not as connected and clear and maintained as needed. And for possible users, we hypothesize it's not creating enough safety from car speeds and in such streets. And during these projects, little is given to tackle harassment and social stigma in some areas against women cycling. However, it's mainly covered through the groups, as I have said. And yeah, so currently we're starting to study these projects and doing interviews after the desk research phase. And what we're going to see is how these projects have changed the numbers of bicycle usage, and see if the current movement and momentum has potential for pushing cycling as a commuting mode, or we are going to lose this momentum and continue on car-centric planning. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. So for all the people who joined us a bit later, you can post your questions in the Q&A part here at Zoom. And the audience can also rate questions that have been asked by liking them. So more relevant questions will come up. Until now, I only see 2 questions. I also have one for myself. As we're not too many, I would ask Clara to simply unmute herself. I think everyone, can do this now, and ask her questions directly.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Thank you for the session and for your presentations. Very different and very insightful, all of them. I posted 2 questions, one to Camille and one to Georg. I even have a third one for Ahmed now. Maybe we start with the one to Camille, because you were the first one presenting. I was just wondering, when listening to it, and I mean, you looked at many, many different countries, and I can only tell from some experiences, but for instance, when I was at the Philippines is the experience that came to my mind, where I think religious and cultural aspects play a very high role in this whole debate. So maybe you can just tell us a bit about your insights in this regard and what role this plays, in your opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Clara, for this. It's very pertinent, important question. So yeah, our study is as you know, done at a very large scale. So what we did is to control for age at marriage that we consider as a proxy for cultural aspect, but we realized that this is a quite imperfect way to measure religious aspect or cultural aspects. So I think such things could be studied at a more disaggregated level, because yeah, it's a bit difficult, I think, to measure cultural cultural aspects or religion when you have as many countries in such like in this study. So I think, yeah, now what we could do is to add a proxy that's age at marriage, but in order to really go deeper into what are the specific cultural constraints specific to each country, I think you need actually to go on the field and to understand the culture. I think this is really difficult to do with a quantitative analysis.
Yeah.
So I really see this as a complementary work that I would really like to, well, I would like to do it, but or that other people could take this this work. That would be great. But yeah, this is super important for this topic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as you said, I also thought maybe it will be probably easier to do this in a more qualitative way. One could also ask hospitals or like birth centers, etc. But yeah, very, very interesting research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So Clara, you had another question for Georg. You want to ask it now, or?
As you like. You said you also have a question. If it's too,
I do.
Could also
pick up yours as well. This is okay because it has like you raised the question about the interaction of the public and private sector, and whether there was a dialogue happening between the two. And I would like to add also to this dimension of questioning a bit your framework that you put up so far, because you said you want to have, you want to look at it through the lens of the political economy, right? So when, like from my perspective, kind of from peace and conflict research, political sciences, particularly working on the global south, I would translate it as follows. So the public sector basically means these are resources coming from the state, and actors somehow related or having access to state resources can profit from them. So I wasn't surprised at all when you told me that equity wasn't the most, well, the result that was found in these programs, but rather there was somehow a distribution. But the question is there a logic behind it? Can be correlated with clientelistic patronage networks? And this would be something for field research, really to ask the people, you know why this village got access and yours got not. And this, of course, then brings in the question of the political regime as well, where, for instance, the private sector might also play a different role. So when we think of the private sector, we think of business interests, of making money, stuff like that. But in an autocracy, a private sector also needs to watch out for its relation with the regime. So, for instance, in Tunisia, under Ben Ali in dictatorship, private sector companies were obliged to provide jobs when the ruling party called and said, we need jobs for this bunch of people, so just create them. So private sector wasn't just like a rational, efficient business, like profit-oriented machine only, but it also played along the lines of the political economy. So when you have this fine-grained model, and I think, looking at stakeholders, different actors, maybe just need to fill it in more like informal networks. You mentioned it, but I didn't see it then, or maybe that's how the way you want to operationalize it in your own research then. But I think this will give you a lot of clue about who gets access to what, and how these patterns might also change over time, of course, but also the struggles that might be happening between the private and the public. Yep.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. I think I can try to answer both questions at the same time from Clara and you, Irene. Thank you. No, that's a very good hint, actually, that the private sector is not really as efficient or as rational, as you say, as in other contexts, because I think it's the case in Tanzania as well, that of course the private sector is driven by the political conditions and so first of all, my research, what I have presented was of course a very short version of it. So we actually apply three different perspectives. The first one is these case studies as discussed. We also look at the financing perspective. So where is financing for energy access or electricity access in Tanzania coming from? And we look at the geographical distribution. And so the financing is actually quite interesting because you can see that it is coming, so electricity access is mostly financed by international donors and the development environment. And that is international. However, it's kind of public because it's a government, it's mostly government driven, this money. And and then the country itself or the state itself is also kind of dependent on this money flow. And the private sector who gets the money to implement it, or the NGO, which is kind of a private non-governmental organization, but running with state money from abroad. So you can see there's a correlation, and you can see that the correlation is actually, when you look at the geographical dimension as well, that however it is public, let's say, development aid money, the money and the operation or the impact of the money you can see only or mostly in the areas where there's already development, because they don't go actually in the very southern parts of Tanzania, where it's hardly any economic activity and so on. It is actually interesting when you look at the geographical distribution that it's mostly clustered around the highly populated areas in the northern parts near to Arusha, Lake Victoria and Dar es Salaam, which you can see then there's a correlation. There's definitely a correlation. I mean, my analysis and my data is not as granular that I can really say, okay, this is interconnected to this. That could be prone to more research. That should be actually considered for more research. However, it is very interesting when you try to take a broader perspective to see that it's that the planning and actually that you really have to work together in order to make it happen. To say, okay, if you really want to provide universal access to electricity in one country, you cannot only rely on one player or to say on one approach, but you have to consider all the different actors. And that is something we try to, well, at least point out with our research. And then of course we need more empirical research to take it further. But it's a very good point to say that although the private sector is not completely on its own, so it's definitely an interconnection there, needed.
Thank you very much. I have one question here from Felipe. Would you like to read it out loud yourself?
Yes. So my question is to Camille, and it is, what potential drawbacks from these rather external introduction of what you call modern energy technologies did you find or come across in your research? Do you think that there is a potential danger that with lacking, especially local social appropriation of those modern technologies, deploying them can cause unintended negative consequences, both in terms of these gender justice aspects that you mentioned, but possibly other aspects as well?
Yes. Thanks for your question. I'm gonna get it here as well. So in my work, I have to say I don't really focus on the implementation of how modern energy will access will be implemented. If that was your question. If your question is whether access to modern energy can have some negative consequences, regardless of the mean, I would say not so much, even though people can perceive, before having access, people can perceive that these new technologies will not necessarily benefit to their well-being. There was a very recent study published that looked for a country, what was the perception of women regarding those new technologies before and after having access to those. And often access to these modern types of energy would be perceived as something that reduces their independence, their financial independence, because they have to buy it, whereas before they maybe had to pick it up in the forest or in the woods. Or another thing is that it can also reduces social interaction within communities, because for example, going to pick up wood together with women is sometimes something where a place where women can stay together and be just between them. So it's like a privileged moment, perceived as a privileged moment sometimes. But what is really interesting is that they found that after having access to those, the perception on their own well-being changed to something entirely positive. So yeah, I'm not sure that that entirely answers your question. In case not, you can write in the chat.
Thank you very
and
much.
Thanks for your question.
Okay, and then there's a last bunch of questions going to Ahmed. If I may, I just summarize them, if this is okay. So Camille just asked you via the chat, so that the fact that cyclists are disproportionately affected by air pollution, which we all know is quite heavy in Cairo and big cities across the world. So her question is, to what extent do current cycling policies combine a more integrated framework to reduce air pollution, car traffic, or to develop public transportation? Then Clara asks about the role of civil society and whether it plays a role at the moment in promoting cycling. Like she brings the example of Berlin, where regular critical mass demonstrations happen to take place, where a big group of cyclists come together and they cycle through the city together. So there's something like this existing in Cairo. And I would just like to add a very short question. Were there any changes or new initiatives coming up with the corona pandemic? Because this was something that we could see in Germany, that, well, cycling was very hip from one moment to the other when you didn't want to squeeze with others in buses. And of course, public transportation is also another topic in Cairo as well. So were there like new dynamics, people wanted to shift to bicycles? Was there something like this going on? Yeah, that'd be my question.
Okay, thank you for the questions. First, Camille. Yeah, we're trying to explore how street users sacrifice for the projects targeted at other users. Currently, with the projects that we listed, the ones by the government and the private sector are not part of a larger policy and are not connected to nearby projects for street widening or public transportation. However, there are two projects, one by the UNDP and one by UN Habitat, and these combine projects for mass transit with cycling infrastructure. However, it's been taking a lot of time, and not all of the goals have been applied yet. Otherwise, the other projects are all like single decisions done independently of a larger plan. And this is maybe related also to the question by Clara. There used to be things similar to critical mass in Egypt. It was a yearly event, however, it stopped around 4 years ago. And it has been harder to organize public gatherings and get permissions and deal with it with security. It's dangerous to do critical mass without security permits in Egypt. And this is related to the other way groups are advocating now. It's mainly through gathering together and pushing their connections to meet someone and talk, and then talk on media, social media, and so on. And that is why maybe also it's all independent projects. It's not part of a larger policy so far. We're trying to organize more, but so far all we have is these small unconnected initiatives. And then the third question from Irene. Yeah, during the lockdown, spring and summer in Egypt, we recorded that there was a sharp increase in sales of bicycles in bicycle shops in Cairo. We couldn't say precisely how many are using the bicycles for sports, because also gyms were closed, and this was a concern for people other than the concern for public transportation. We couldn't know exactly how many were for sports and how many were for commuting, but there weren't also public information about it or projects about it. Several groups, including us, are trying to initiate tactical interventions and pop-up lanes. However, these also have been taking time to get the permissions, and we passed the peak of the first wave and we haven't finished the permissions yet. But let's see.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for this panel and your various and very different, very inspiring insights about the complexities, how policies are interrelated, but also how policy changes might be affected by formal, informal structures, and how difficult it can be to get a hold on them. So this is all very important, as we could see. We just tackled a few issues, so this highlights once more the importance of this overall event. I wish you all a fantastic conference while we move on, and while I pass on to Katrin, who has some final organizational information for you. And I'm happy that we just stole 5 minutes of your coffee break. But anyhow, I hope to see you in other panels then. And yeah, I give the word to Katrin now.
Thank you very much. So once again, on behalf of the organizers as well, thank you very much to all the speakers of the session, and special thanks to Irene as well for taking over the role of the moderation here. So it was a pleasure to work with you. We just wanted to share some information. So we have above like 250 participants registered, and we recorded this session. So after today's event, so we will upload the sessions as well. So the recordings, so everyone else who couldn't join the session is actually able to watch the session afterwards. And yeah, if you share the slides to the speakers, we can upload these as well, so that you can check as well if you want to read some of these slides again. We are happy to share these. And then I just wanted to quickly show you that we will have coffee and tea breaks now. So here you will see coffee in the yurt was RLI and tea in the igloo was Agia. So if you want to meet the organizing team behind, so Rainer Lemont Institute or the IKEA network, please feel free to join them in the coffee break and tea break. And actually for the RLI, we have a special guest in the afternoon as well, Mr. Pravesh Raghu. So he is kind of an island research expert as well. And if you're a researcher, I think it's very important or very interesting for you to join as well the Tea and the Igloo with IKEA, because there are a lot of nice opportunities for networking and exchanging for your research as well. And with that, yeah, I relieve you to to the coffee and tea break. And once again, thanks for coming and thanks for contributing. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.